Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I think the best way of characterizing this administration, it is essentially the kind of monetization of US hegemony. The less polite way is something about a mafioso shakedown.
I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Government and Economics at Bloomberg, and this is Trumponomics, the podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, how he's already shaped the global economy, and what on earth is going to happen next. This week, we're widening the lens a bit, because I just had a fascinating conversation I'd like to share with you. The occasion was Bloomberg's second Women, Money and Power event in London, and the conversation was with Alessandra Galloni, the editor-in-chief of Reuters news agency, and Zanny Minton Beddoes, editor-in-chief of The Economist. The title of our session was Reporting on Money and Power in the Current Moment. And there was plenty of Trumponomics in the mix, but what you'll also hear is how all three of us have been grappling with not just the sheer volume of news coming out of Washington, but also the Trump administration's aggressive approach to handling the media. We see that obviously in the Jimmy Kimmel saga and the many lawsuits the president has filed against the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, most of the traditional US news networks. But it's also something we've been living with behind the scenes since the White House took control of the White House press pool and dramatically cut the mainstream media's regular access to the president. So yes, it's a little bit more introspective than our usual discussions on Trumponomics. But like it or not, Donald Trump is leaving his mark on journalism as well as the global economy. And sitting at the helm of these two major news organisations, Zanny and Alessandra, have a bird's eye view of both. I started by asking Alessandra, 8 months in, how this Trump administration had changed the way Reuters did its job.
I think there's sort of two buckets, right? There's what you have to do journalistically, and then it's sort of how you go about it and navigate some of the new rules that have come in. Journalistically, I think, the bottom line is sort of a back to the future. You do what we always do, which is you report this administration. And what we try to do is we try to report what matters, what the real effects of the executive orders are, or what the real effects of changes in policy, new laws are. So, for example, just yesterday, we had a story that looked at how prosecutions for drug abuse or for money laundering or for financial crimes that used to be prosecuted a lot in the U.S. have now sort of given way to deportations because so much attention of the Trump administration is focused on deportations that a lot of the same sort of prosecutors and officers who were focusing on one type of crime are now focusing on what Trump classifies as another type of crime. So again, what flows from changes in policy? That's just one example. I mean, it's just worth perhaps mentioning a few of the restrictions that we've had. The new one is on the Pentagon reporting, which all of us have, which is that there's a new rule now or a new request for all journalists who cover the Pentagon to sign a piece of paper saying that essentially we wouldn't publish something that could be in a security interest of the U.S., without checking with the Pentagon first, essentially. Now, of course, that is something that we can't do, right? And that is something that I think, to my knowledge, virtually nobody has signed this, right? And you face the same thing. And so we're, talking to the administration about how we can change this. And interestingly, what we understand is that it's actually aimed more at people who work in the Pentagon to avoid them from leaking. And of course, leaks also have been sort of more kind of criminalized. There's been a criminalization of what the administration would call leaks. So I think on the reporting side, we keep reporting on the news, trying to, understand what is going on, and then sort of try to convince the administration that, First Amendment press freedom is something important for everyone, no matter where you operate in the U.S. or, in our case, in all the 200 other countries where we work.
And as wire news services, obviously Reuters and Bloomberg have been affected by just taking the wires out of the Oval Office as a matter of course, off the plane. There was always a wire journalist previously on the plane, or more than one. There's just a consistent sort of lack of people to ask questions, or questions that aren't along the lines of, Mr. President, how do you look so healthy and so much younger than in your previous administration? But, Zanny, you're in a slightly different position with The Economist, but I know but obviously you have much the same journalistic mission. How are you dealing with the different approach that this administration has?
What we do is to join the dots between geopolitics, business, technology, to help our readers understand where the world is going. And that mission is exactly the same as it always has been. And the Trump administration changed our framework because the Trump administration is so dominant in pretty much every global story. And so for me, one of the things that has changed is that I spend a lot of time making sure that we differentiate between the signal and the noise. If you're not careful, every story about every part of the world could start with a reference to Donald Trump. And so I spend quite a lot of time either literally or at least figuratively crossing out first paragraphs that mention Trump too much. It would be incredibly boring if you had every single story framed in a Trump way. Differentiating the signal from the noise also means, not suffering from Trump derangement syndrome and being fair-minded about the way you cover this administration. We have a lot of Republican readers. We have a lot of Trump administration people read us, and indeed Trumpians read us. And I think it's very important that even people who don't share the Economist's worldview, we believe in liberal values. We were founded to champion them. They drive what we do. But I feel very strongly that even people who do not share that view should find our journalism useful. And so we need to be rigorous, fact-based. We need to really go the extra mile to make sure we are fair-minded in our analysis. And that's doubly important at this moment. In terms of the kind of way we deal with it, of course, things have changed for us too. All my non-American journalists, when they go to the US now, including me, carry I think it's a G29 form. It's a form that if you are stopped by the Customs and Border Patrol, you sign it. I'm sure you have it too. And they have to call our lawyer in the US. I look at my phone before I go. I scrub my phone to make sure that just in case, I have to say, I've gone to the US every week this month and I've sailed in and I have global entry and it's all been fine.
You're not well known for your scurrilous posts, but...
Exactly, but I just think it's prudent. And that is a weird feeling. I've been to China many, many times and I have never scrubbed my phone. I've taken a burner computer, so there are different behaviours that I do there. But so the environment has changed, undoubtedly. It's a long answer to your question, but it makes me value our independence more. This sounds incredibly pretentious and I don't mean it to be, but I think we should all be thinking not just about the here and now, but how are our successors going to look at what we did? Did we go overboard with Trump derangement syndrome, or did we normalize totally non-normal behavior and fail to, raise enough red flags about what is potentially happening to American democracy? And I think the balance between those two is what I'm figuring out.
I think we do find the White House team particularly, I think, is having to use its thesaurus very often on different words for unprecedented. That's the way you put it in perspective and don't normalise it while still reporting it. Just to come back on you, Zanny, because I was struck by this a couple of weeks ago. There's a version of Trump derangement syndrome when one's thinking about global affairs and global events. And I was struck, the Shanghai summit and then the parade in China, a lot of the coverage saw everything that was happening in Beijing as a response to Trump, and indeed India, Prime Minister Modi's going to China, all of that as being entirely a response to what Donald Trump had done and the trade wars and other things, which in many ways was true, or at least was one way of looking at it. But there was another way, which I got from talking to my Indian colleagues and our geoeconomics analyst in India, that it was entirely in line with Prime Minister Modi's own objectives. He needed to have a relationship with China because it's a key part of his domestic manufacturing agenda, that he needed access to these inputs from China, and we could show how many inputs he relied on, etc., etc. It struck me that was true for almost every country there, that you could also just re-describe what they were doing as not putting two fingers up to Donald Trump, but pursuing their national interests in a world in which the US has, to some extent, stepped back. So how do you guard against that? That's an aspect of the same issue.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's a sort of another way of framing the too much focus on Trump. I think two ways. Firstly, what is happening right now is a period of extraordinary uncertainty because we've got at least three massive great shifts going on in the world economy. One is the geopolitical shift, which is driven in part by the administration, but was also starting long before. The rise of China, the kind of authoritarian axis. There were big shifts going on before the Trump administration. Secondly, the huge economic shift, which again predated the sort of end of the unfashionability of the worldview of The Economist started long before Donald Trump became president. But he's taken it a step further with massive protectionist turn. And then the third one is the technological revolution, who wins the AI race. And all three of those are driving the world, and all three of those are driving what Prime Minister Modi is doing, or Brazil is doing, or any country is doing. And so you're right. If you only think of this through the prism of the US and through Trump, you're missing something. And one stat for this, I think the US is, what you'll know the number exactly, I think the US is 16% of global trade. It's a relatively small proportion. Of course, it's dominant in global finance, but that suggests that a lot of what is going on is actually external to the United States. And so we have to absolutely make sure that we don't overemphasize the impact of this hyperactive and, of course, extremely important administration.
I completely agree. I think nobody doubts that. The U.S. administration is important, and what has been happening with issues like global trade, geopolitics is no question something that we need to cover. But the risk is if we only cover it from the vantage point of the U.S., we miss what's actually happening in other countries. And we may find ourselves, to your point about 10 years from now, 20 years from now or more, we may miss the epochal shifts in places like China and India because we've only been focusing on them as a result of the U.S. administration. And then equally, this counts on one of the key things for journalists is to be open-minded. You have to be open to the possibility that your idea, your original idea, your original hypothesis is wrong. And I think that the mainstream press, as we sometimes were called, has a certain view of this administration. And we need to be open to the possibility that the U.S. economy is not going to collapse because of what is happening, because that inflation is not going to be what people feared because of the tariff policy, that, the institutions of the state of law, the institutions in the U.S. will not collapse necessarily, that they're strong and that they will last some of the attacks, right? I mean, I mentioned before, in passing, some of the new attorney general's rules against sort of leaks, leaks by journalists. Well, you know what? Actually, what it reversed was a policy of the Biden administration. It went back to a policy of the Obama administration vis-a-vis journalists. And so I think everybody was ready. So even though we are there in the rooms and we are fighting for press freedom, we also have to put it into context, right? And not criminalize everything that is done by this administration while standing firm to fact check everything that is said.
I want to do a bit more on the economics, not least because this is going to be going out on my Trumponomics podcast, which you can get at anywhere.
Maybe
you
should
get
call
your
it something different.
I know. I can't speak about derangement syndrome on the name of the podcast. I think the closest thing to a consistent principle of Trumponomics as it's applied globally has been that the rest of the world should just pay for stuff that previously it got, quote unquote, for free from the US, whether that's reserve currency, security umbrella, a certain kind of global order. And I think the assumption at the beginning of the year might have been that countries were going to push back a bit more than they have. Have you been surprised, Zanny, by how effective the administration has been short-term at dividing and ruling?
So first of all, I think your characterization is spot on. I think the best way of characterizing this administration, and people have, over the last few months have talked about, is it isolationist? Is it great power theories? It's not. It is essentially, the polite way is a kind of monetization of US hegemony. Oh. The less polite way is something about a mafioso shakedown. And you can take your pick, which one you want to use. But that really is the common thread that goes through all of the administration's international economic actions. I'm struck, if you'd said to me in March, just before Liberation Day, and you'd said to me, the Trump administration is going to increase America's effective tariff from around 2% to about 19%, and it's going to have 50% tariffs on countries like India and 35% on Canada, I would have said the odds are we are going to go into some kind of 1930s style tit-for-tat trade war. There's going to be retaliation, and actually you're right, the surprising thing is that two things happened. Xi Jinping retaliated and America caved. Very clearly, Trump realized that he couldn't win that. And then the other countries have essentially all tried to strike deals. And what we haven't had is a kind of collective, we're standing up to this. And so in the short term, you're right, it's been quite successful. I'm not at all sure it's going to be successful in the medium term. Because I think, firstly, America loses out. I mean, I'm a card-carrying free trader, and I believe that the country that imposes tariffs does lose out. The consumer does pay. It's not good for American competitiveness. And although it may not cause an inflation problem in the short term, in the long term, this is bad for the United States. And therefore, I think the rest of the world has shown very clearly that it does have no intention of going down this route. And so you will see greater coordination between different regional trade agreements. And I actually think, it won't be the WTO, it won't be the old system, but you will have something that resembles a rules-based trading system, increasingly excluding the US. And that is not good for the US in the medium term.
The system has worked, ultimately. What you're saying is that global trade, to a certain extent, has worked because we've seen the deals that have been struck. It has been a huge overhaul of the system, but we thought that there would be more of a dismantling at the end. We have to see. We have to see.
I think it is a new system, but I think that it is that we will see a limit to the ability, even of the US, to shake down countries over the medium term. I think this is the height of the shakedown ability.
And China, as you say, was the one. There was no way that you could push further with China, and that's why he backtracked.
Well, and as Zanny points out, there's more than 80% of global trade.
Can I do some shameless self-promotion, since this is going to be on your
in return for coming
podcast,
to this conference, you may.
Which is that, as you may know, next week we're launching the Economist Insider, series of video shows on. There'll be specialist ones, and I will co-host a weekly one. But the first episode will be along this track, and as part of it, I have an interesting conversation with Prime Minister Mark Carney on precisely this topic. So you should listen to it.
All right, watch this space.
The other thing I think we should not forget is that a lot of Trump's policies that are ostensibly about economics or ostensibly about global trade or are actually about getting something else in the geopolitical sphere, and that his linkage policy is very strong. So I will put
what the king feels like.
Exactly.
This is a court with the king, and the king likes his mate
put
Bolsonaro
on you so that then you're going to stop, sign a peace deal, right?
Alessandra, do you actually think in this environment, I think we've all agreed that there's a kind of short-term getting along with the US, but long-term, a real erosion of US position and potentially a vacuum into which other countries will move in. Do you think there's any scope for Europe to step up in this environment? There's a lot of pressure.
There's certainly scope. There's a big question as to whether Europe will. But I think another point, and I know we reached the end, that I think we also shouldn't forget. Recently, actually, we were in the room together when we were talking to the former head of MI6, I think, at Davos in January. And one of the things that...
I think this was off the record.
That was all right. Well, what I'm about to say is... okay, I think he's resigned. He's moving on.
We're among friends.
Among friends. No, but one of the things that I thought was very interesting is how much of an emphasis he put on the fact that leave aside the heads of the organizations, the top organizations of the US and of the UK, but that a lot of the work is done at the second and third level, and a lot of the relations, and he was talking about security, but you could extend this to many other areas, is actually done not at the top levels, and that the coordination and collaboration still goes on. And I was really struck by that because it suggested to me that, administrations come and go and they are important. And this administration may lead to another same administration. We just don't know what's going to happen, right? But that actually between countries and among countries, a lot of the work that holds policies together is still going on.
And that is actually a lot of the concerns. We have pretty much run out of time, but I do want to, just because you are also leaders of people and managers of people. And this is a pretty fractious, often emotive journalistic environment for particularly reporters in the US to navigate. And we've seen that in spades over the last few weeks. So I just wondered, both of you, how much have you had to think about that? Have you had issues with people either with burnout or just people struggling to sort of hold that line? Because you both stand for objective, rigorous reporting.
The answer is people feel very, very strongly about what's going on. I think we benefit from we don't have to, we do different kind of journalism to you two. So we have the time to discuss and debate. And what's most important to me is that people feel their voices are heard. And so we have lots of discussions about a lot of these subjects. And we may end up often with leader lines that I'm fairly sure some of my team don't agree with. But as long as they've had their voices heard, and I think it's people, I can speak for my colleagues, they have been extraordinary in their sort of professionalism and the way that they have risen to the challenge. They understand that our role is to make sense of what is happening, explain it to our readers around the world, never compromise on our underlying values. We are a liberal newspaper, classic English liberalism. We proudly champion that. But you can do that and at the same time have fair-minded journalism that distinguishes between the signal and the noise. And I think everyone is completely on board with that.
We have a slightly different situation. You know, we're obviously on the sharp edge of a lot of what happens in the world, and including in conflict. I mean, we've been talking about economics, but we have the other half of our newsroom, is in war zones. We have many people in Ukraine, on battlefields around the world. So for us, there's a real imperative to keep our people safe physically all the time, and that is becoming increasingly difficult. It's no secret. I've been in this job as EIC for 4 years, and we've lost 4 journalists. So, in conflict. So the physical remains very, very important because there are a lot of actual kinetic situations on the ground. But to your point, which is more sort of the emotional aspect of it, no, it's very real. Our journalists in the U.S. are feeling the same sort of pressures that many of our journalists in other countries feel. And so, we do a lot of hostile environment courses. Those are mainly for physical protection, but increasingly we use a lot of mental health protection, how to protect your mental health, how to keep yourself safe, scrubbing your phone, digitally. And we have introduced many, many more sessions on hostile environment writ large in the US than we ever could have imagined.
We're rolling out trainings that we've never before done in the US. And to your point, people who are in the Washington Bureau who have come from Latin American countries and others are finding this much more familiar territory. Okay, final very quick question. We've none of us managed to get sued, our organisation, so far by the administration. Will you be a little bit embarrassed if you're not by the end of the administration?
No, I genuinely don't think about it. I will be embarrassed if we haven't done the best possible coverage. And that is, if that leads to us being sued, so be it.
Yeah,
are you expecting
our general counsel
lawyering up?
Our general counsel, have plenty of work to do with all the investigations that we do and all of the countries we operate in. So I think they've got plenty to handle.
Alessandra, Zanny, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for listening to Trumponomics from Bloomberg. It was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and I was in a conversation with the Reuters editor-in-chief, Alessandra Galloni, and the Economist's editor-in-chief, Zanny Minton Beddoes. Trumponomics was produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam, and special thanks this week to the organisers of the Women, Money and Power event at Bloomberg's headquarters in London. Sound design was by Blake Maples and Kelly Gary, and Amy Keane is our executive producer. Sage Bowman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. To help others find the show, please rate it and review it highly wherever you listen to podcasts.